let's make a custom Hive Fleet for the Tyranids. To begin, we will start with having the model partially made. The torso is attached with the head, and the legs and the hip are also made. The arms will be kept separately, and as you can see, we'll start from a solid red priming coat. So, before we continue in getting the colouring down, we will need to work on the undercoating in preparation for the next steps. We will give everything a generous coating of scale 75 black leather. The reason why we'll be using this paint is scale 75 doesn't mix well when put through an airbrush, and you end up losing a lot of the opacity in its colour. But this is exactly what we want. We aren't looking to cover the base colouring. The next step is now to work on getting the fleshy colour tones down. For this, we will first put down one of the highest and brightest colours that we'll be using to achieve the skin tone. Mix in Vallejo model colour Pale Sands and Salmon Rose in a 2:1 ratio. 2 parts Pale Sands, 1 part Salmon Rose. With this layer, we are looking to get a varying range of coverage. On the higher areas, we want a high level of opacity, but on the lower areas and recesses, we want to maintain the previous purple and red from the priming stage. So, what we'll be doing is many thin layers in building up these layers to the correct opacity on each area. With the torso, we'll want to keep the ribs and the recesses more shaded and have more of the redness showing through. As for the limbs, we want to exaggerate the muscles to simulate a cast shadow in separating the muscles. So, focusing on a downward application from above will do the trick. The next layer will be just using pure Salmon Rose. This time targeting the larger and flatter areas while still avoiding much of the recesses and shadows. So, taking the same approach as before, this layer should mimic our previous layer, but at the same time we are trying to avoid the highest and sharpest areas. This next layer will be using neat Reichland flesh through the airbrush. Because this is a wash, we will need to be mindful not to create any pooling. So, a few thin layers and a little dry time between each layer will work. With this layer, we are trying to target the points which the flesh would be darker. Most of the underside, the crevices and the tightly packed skin areas, such as the joints and the skin as it attaches to the carapace. The next part is to now apply Reichland flesh shade all over the skin. But before we go in and slap this all over the model, we want to thin this mixture down into a 2:1 ratio. 2 parts medium, 1 part wash. Again, be careful not to cause any pooling. While we are going through the process of washing, there are a few bugbears which bother me with the washing technique. Firstly, it's not always easy to control the wash. Just like with everything on Earth, gravity will eventually win. And with that, there is usually spots which run and go left unnoticed until it's too late. This results in having awful coffee stains, as we call it. Secondly, a wash will tone down any paintwork that you have placed beforehand. Now, in our case, this works, because they used colours and tones which complement this shade tone. But sometimes you end up with a stronger than anticipated shift in tones. So, for myself, I always feel more stressed than satisfied when it comes to the overall acrylic wash type. And this is where the urge to try something different has come from. That's why I decided to gravitate towards oils and enamels. A lot of that concern is manageable or can be mitigated. Now with the wash down, set it aside and let everything dry. Here is how the model is looking after. If I say so myself, it is a little dull. So let's re-pick out the highlights. So to do this, we will be using our very first colour mix of Pale Sands and Salmon Rose. This time round, we are trying to catch the very top portions where the light would be the most concentrated. With the skin now finished in its main colouring, it's time to move on to the carapace pieces. But before we move on, we will want a way to protect all of the hard work that we have just done so far. So, using our trusted masking tape and then our liquid mask to fill any of the tight gaps. With the liquid mask, coat it heavily and overlap it onto the masking tape. This way it's easier to peel off along with the tape. With the skin now protected, we will base all of the carapace pieces in a mix of salmon rose and Reikland flesh tone. This is in a 1:1 mix. This should give a nice dark pinky colouring. Once everything has been coated, give it a few minutes to dry. The next step will be to coat everything that we have just done with Reikland flesh tone wash. Again, be careful not to cause pooling. Take the time to get some smooth coatings. Next up is using salmon rose and applying this into all of the recesses of the carapace, ensuring that the overspill doesn't go entirely onto the overlapping piece. A few simple streaks and this step is done. For the next colour, we will be applying black brown, and this colour is for the tips and the ends of the carapace armour pieces. This part can be a little bit tricky, because we don't want any of this to overspray or come into contact with the deeper recesses, which is the brighter area. This colour is specifically reserved for the tips of the carapace. With the colouring of the armour now complete, we can start the process of removing all of the masking and tape from the model. This will either be incredibly satisfying or very infuriating. Finally, we can start to see how the overall model is going to look like. Because this model is looking a little bit muted in its tone, I want to add a little bit of popping detail. And for this, we'll be applying a bold colouring to selected areas to draw the viewer's attention. So, using light turquoise, we will apply this colour onto the tail, into the corners of the weapons, and then into the soft tissue of the torso, neck and the groin. Now, using the same colour, we will be applying a few streaks coming from the soft centres of the carapace. At this stage, the paint is thinned to an almost glaze consistency. Small, quick and sharp movements will give you crisp and sharp lines. We will be repeating this step across every armour piece. Once that layer has been done, we will then repeat the process again but dilute the colour further. This time we'll be wanting to leave a fainter mark. Once this step is dry, we will then apply a thin streak into the deep recess and the crack of the carapace. With the majority of the model now based and painted, the only major parts to quickly tackle is the half-blown skull of Old One-Eye. So, taking Zandri dust and basing the skeleton skull, a quick coating of Seraphim Sepia, another highlight with Zandri dust, and then using pale sands to extreme highlight. Phew, there is a lot of skin colouring going on here.
Is there anything else we can add to this model?
Well, sure, but that's effort. So no, we're just going to keep the model as it is for now. It's much easier for batch painting.
But aren't you going to use anything else? Any new cool tricks?
No, not really.
Well, can you show us something? You know this is an important model to some of us.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. Come on. So, just as we said, we can start to apply more detail onto the model with the use of oils. Mixing down Abteilung 502 brown wash and Starship Filth in a 2:1 mix ratio, we will then thin the mixture down with turpentine to create a thin wash. Now you can easily apply this by brush, Again, just be careful of the pooling as the surface tension is very, very low. But in this case, we'll be applying the wash with an airbrush. And because this is spirits, you must ensure that you are in a well ventilated area and wearing a good quality respirator. Once all the pieces have had a good coating, give it a few minutes for the spirits to dry. And now it's time to take the Q-tips and begin to clear the brown wash off. This will leave the deeper recesses detailed and the higher areas will return to their original colouring before this stage. The next stage is bringing out some of the highlights to blend in with the shading. Here we're going to be dry brushing the model using Abtalung 502 light flesh tones and buff in a 2:1 mix, with a very small touch of faded flesh. Now when it comes to dry brushing oils, the paint will transfer very easily from the brush onto the model. So you'll need to make sure that the brush is 99.9% clean before you apply the paint onto the model. A small rule of thumb is, if you think the brush is clear, give it another dab, work the paint more, and then start buffing the model. Once you are satisfied with the brush, start to buff the paint onto the model, focusing slightly on the highest and sharpest points of the model, but also catching some of the flatter and wider spots facing the light. The next step is repeating the same process again, but only using light flesh tones, and this is reserved for the highest points and the brightest areas of the model. Just something to take note of when it comes to dry brushing oils. If you do end up applying too much of the colour or applying the paint onto an area that was unintended, it is very easy to clear this up. You can simply take a clean brush and buff the paint into the model, further reducing it, or simply take a Q-tip with some white spirits and gently clean the area. Now that we are mostly done with the model itself, it's time to move on to the next part, which is the base. Now, for Carnifexes, I didn't want to use their standard base. It seems far too small for the model, let alone doing anything creative. So for this, we'll be using the larger size oval base which fits the Carnifex better. Because we are trying to bring this world to life, I wanted to capture this monster in the element and the environment that this Hive Fleet will be set in. A dark, dingy, swampy, poisonous marsh. So to capture some of the rocky earth, I'll be using cork bark which has been broken into smaller pieces, and this will be glued directly onto the base. With the bark in place, we will now start to apply some Smart Mud 2.0. This is reserved for the banks of the bark and to fill in any of the voids and holes between the bark and the base. Now for this part I quickly painted the base just so I got an idea of what I'm trying to achieve. But the next part is to bring that muddy banked area out more and start applying some small rocks and scatter to the base. So taking diluted Mod Podge, I'll begin to apply this to the area in which I want to apply the scatter. This is on the bank, between the rocks, and leading into the centre of the base. With the glue placed, we will now use dried dirt from the garden, ensuring to get a varying size of grains. So you may need to break some of the dirt down. This process is repeated until we get the correct amount that we want. Once we are happy, we will then apply isopropyl alcohol all over the glued areas to break any surface tension created by the dry earth and the water in the glue dilute. Then we will apply another layer of glue on top. Now before we continue, we will need to give the base some time to dry. With the base dry, we are ready to start the painting process. To begin, the entire base is coated in black brown. Then medium brown was applied into random areas, followed by another coat of pale brown to emphasize these patches. Then to finish the painting, we'll be using golden olive to create random tendrils spanning across the base. Now comes the big guns for the base. Because this will be a swamp, I wanted to have the majority of the base submerged into swampy water. So before we can get into adding the water, we will need to make a container for the base. So using superglue and some thick card, this is glued to the edge all around the base. Once it's all in place, using some more superglue to close any of the gaps at the bottom, and then using Vaseline to paint the inside of the card so the resin won't stick to it. With the base now painted and ready to take the resin, all that's left to do is stick the model into place. With that done, let's get to the most nerve-wracking part. Mixing up only 75 milliliters of resin, I have also added 2 drops of blue wash and 3 drops of sepia to the resin. Ensuring that no resin is leaking, it's time to start adding the details of debris and foliage. So, taking some roots found outside, this will be added into the resin, climbing back up the mud banks and the rocks. A few roots were added into the middle of the resin, just randomly floating. Another foliage that we'll be adding is dried flowers. These are of varying colours, red, oranges and some dark yellows. This will give a nice contrast against the greenish water. These are added as if they began at the crack of the rocks and spreading out over the calm waters. With that now done, it's time to cover the model and let it sit for 24 hours. So, after 24 hours, the first thing to remove is the card. This surprisingly wasn't difficult to remove, so a little tug and the whole card removed quite easily. Any areas left behind were quickly cleaned up with a sharp knife. Because we want to capture some motion coming from this model, we'll be adding some ripples onto the water's surface. But before we get to that stage, it's better to apply any paint details now on the flat surface. So here, we are taking white ink diluted to simulate any bubbles or disturbed water. Once we have some ink on the base, we will start moving it into position and then taking a Q-tip to remove random spots throughout, leaving a small texture behind. This effect was applied to both legs and the tail, which is disturbing the water. Next up is applying water texture from Vallejo. Taking a brush and start applying the mixture straight on top of the resin. Some detail can be added here by using a thin brush to create ripples on the surface. Now it can take some time for the water texture to dry, so again give this a few hours. While we wait for the texture to dry, it's time to glue the remaining of the model together. With everything assembled, all we need to do is clean the base edge, wait for the model to set and dry, and then we are left with this.